Chapter 3, Lost Kin. In the December 1926 issue of Opportunity, Radcliffe-trained anthropologist Caroline Bond Day published a semi-autobiographical story about Sarah, a Negro woman of mixed blood, who enjoyed countless courtesies while wearing a pink hat. The hat was plain and made of straw, but it metamorphosed into a magic carpet and an enchanted cloak, remaking Sarah's drab life into one of possibility and adventure. A gentleman offered her a seat on the train, a young man helped her off of a railway car and retrieved her lost gloves, and a salesgirl addressed her as Mrs., a respectful title reserved for white women only. Lo! The world was reversed, Sarah observed once she allowed the hat to conceal her curly brown hair, accentuate her ruddy complexion, and cast a pink hue over her face. For a few fleeting moments, Sarah glimpsed the pleasures of life beyond the limits of her Jim Crow world: a cold drink at a soda fountain, a pair of shoes purchased in the town's best shop, a comfortable seat in a movie theater, a stroll through an art gallery, a clean ladies' room, all on account of a pink straw hat. But Sarah's world would take a sudden turn when she broke her ankle. Bedridden in her black neighborhood, Sarah relied on the care of her black family when no white physician would treat her. As her ankle slowly healed, so too did her fractured identity. The pink hat had lost its usefulness. As Sarah concluded, with her good health, her loving family, and all the pleasures that her neighborhood had to offer, who'd want a hat? With the bright promises of Reconstruction dashed and the consolidation of the Jim Crow regime complete by 1900, light-skinned blacks had plenty of reasons to pass. Jim Crow's assaults on African American life came in myriad forms: daily frustrations, humiliations, and indignities, political disenfranchisement, economic discrimination, widespread racial violence in threat and in fact, and the pseudoscience of eugenics that announced the biological and physiological inferiority of African Americans. Legalized segregation drew the color line more starkly in both the North and the South, excluding blacks from restaurants, hotels, Pullman cars, and other public accommodations. The rise of a new spokesman, Booker T. Washington, and the pronouncements made in his 1895 Atlanta Compromise address accelerated and sanctioned racial inequality in all forms of political, social, and economic life. Historian C. Vaughan Woodward wrote of Washington, in proposing the virtual retirement of the mass of Negroes from the political life of the South and in stressing the humble and menial role that the race was to play, he would seem unwittingly to have smoothed the path to proscription. More than 500,000 black men became voters in the South after the ratification of the 15th Amendment on March 30, 1870, which extended the right to vote to all American citizens regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But disenfranchisement by way of white primaries, poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather, good character, and understanding clauses systematically removed blacks from the political sphere. When Mississippi was readmitted to the Union in 1870, ex-slaves comprised half of the state's voting population. Between 1870 and 1880, Mississippi voters elected 2 black U.S. senators as well as several black state officials. But in 1890, Mississippi held a convention to rewrite its state constitution to be consistent with the imperative expressed by the convention's president: "We came here to exclude the Negro." The new state constitution included a number of restrictions, including a steep poll tax that had to be paid 2 years in advance of an election, and that was far too expensive for the poorest segment of Mississippi's population. A literacy test required blacks to read and interpret technical and opaque sections of the state constitution to the satisfaction of a white clerk. These policies, known as the Mississippi Plan, made voting a nearly impossible feat for Mississippi's black citizens. Other southern states implemented similar policies of restriction. 90% of African Americans were registered to vote during Reconstruction. By 1892, black voting registration had diminished to less than 6%. By 1940, only 1% of blacks in Mississippi were registered voters. During Reconstruction, an estimated 2,000 African Americans held political office. The U.S. Congress seated 16 African Americans, approximately 600 blacks were elected to state legislatures, and hundreds more served in local offices throughout the South. George Henry White, a congressman from North Carolina elected in 1897, was voted out of office in 1901. White was the last black congressman to serve, and his ouster signaled the symbolic end of black political power, even though some blacks continued to work in local offices. Many lost their positions when President Woodrow Wilson dismissed blacks from the federal bureaucracy in 1913. Congress remained lily-white until 1929 when Oscar De Priest was elected to represent Chicago. Alleged upswings in Negro crime, including a particular paranoia about black men's desire for white women and a bemoaning of the passing of the old Negro, African Americans born into slavery whom Southern whites perceived as harmless and acquiescent to the racial power structure, were used to justify frightening increases in racial violence. Race riots swept through Wilmington in 1898, Atlanta in 1906, and Tulsa in 1921. The Second Klan rose in 1915, white cap riders and lynch mobs went on nigger hunts, and between the years of 1890 and 1917, 2 to 3 black Southerners were murdered each week. A compelling motive to pass as white is expressed most grotesquely at the climax of James Weldon Johnson's 1912 novel, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. It is the sight of a lynched black body, the scorched post, a smoldering fire, blackened bones, charred fragments sifting down through coils of chains, and the smell of burnt flesh in his nostrils that fixed the ex-colored man to the spot where he stood, powerless to take his eyes from what he did not want to see. The omnipresent threat of violence, the likelihood of injury, and the chance of death cast a pall of terror over the everyday lives of African Americans. James Weldon Johnson was nearly lynched by a white mob when he shared a park bench with a light-skinned companion who was mistaken as white. In the novel, the ex-colored man, escaping the agonizing dilemma of black manhood, later feared that he had chosen the lesser part and sold his birthright for a mess of pottage. But the gruesome scene, the spectacle of lynching as a form of white entertainment for a cheering mob, and his realization of the cheapness of black life prompted him to pass. All the while, I understood that it was not discouragement, or fear, or search for a larger field of action and opportunity, that was driving me out of the Negro race. I knew that it was shame, unbearable shame. Shame at being identified with a people that could with impunity be treated worse than animals. For certainly the law would restrain and punish the malicious burning alive of animals. The eugenics movement reached a fever pitch in the 1920s. The science of heredity traveled from Europe around 1900 and found fertile ground in American nativist circles, where conversations about race suicide troubled those who believed in white racial superiority. Eugenicists lamented the failure of the grand old New England stock to reproduce and argued that the human species would progress only if those with the best genes reproduced. They focused their efforts at race improvement on immigration restriction, lent their voices to calls for 100% Americanism, and applauded the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, a bitter restrictionist attack that prohibited Japanese immigration and established a quota system designed to reduce the flood of Southern European immigrants to a mere trickle. Closing the border was at the heart of this crusade, but eugenicists also worried about the consequences of racial intermixture. In Virginia, the state legislature passed the act to preserve racial integrity in 1924 out of a fear that, as one eugenicist explained, many thousands of white Negroes were quietly and persistently passing over the line. This act enshrined the one-drop rule into law by defining a white person as one with no trace of other blood. Never before had racial identity been defined by such a strict standard. The law also forbade interracial marriage between whites and anyone with even the slightest amount of racial mixture. Walter A. Plecker, a physician and the state registrar of Virginia, worked closely with other eugenicists and members of white supremacist Anglo-Saxon clubs to pass the law. Plecker was meticulous, zealous, and fanatical. He treated the work of enforcing the law classifying all Virginians based on color as if it were a religious calling. The achievement of white racial purity in Virginia was a great struggle, Plecker wrote, especially because 19 northern states and the nearby District of Columbia allowed intermarriage. Plecker was especially concerned that mixed-race Virginians were becoming legally white by passing as Indian first. A subsection of the Virginia law, known as the Pocahontas exception, allowed those with 1/16 Indian ancestry to be classified as white and enabled Virginia's oldest families to claim descent from Pocahontas and John Rolfe without tainting their white racial identity. Relying on records that dated back to 1853, Plecker worked tirelessly to disprove the claims of those whom he believed had black ancestry and were trying to pass as Indian or as white. Plecker wrote to the director of the U.S. Census to state as positively and emphatically as possible that there were clusters of Virginians in several counties that should under no circumstances be given classification as Indians in census records. This was a ploy, Plecker surmised, to use identification as Indian as a gateway to passing as white. Day in and day out, from 1924 until his resignation at the age of 85 in 1946, Plecker wrote hundreds of harassing letters to Virginians in a vain attempt to enforce the law. Aileen Hartless was hounded for false statements made by her parents, whom Plecker believed were free blacks before the Civil War and who looked almost white, and are trying to pass as white. When she submitted her birth certificate to obtain a marriage license, She was reminded by Plecker that giving false registration as to race was punishable with 1 year in the penitentiary. Plecker warned Heartless that her case might make it to court if you continue to try to be what you are not. Miss Blanche Cunningham received a letter reminding her that interracial marriage was illegal in the state of Virginia and instructing her to immediately break off entirely with this young mulatto man that she presumed was white and intended to marry. Circuit court clerks in counties across the state were told to delay marriage licenses until the couple's ancestry could be proven to Plecker's satisfaction. Plecker sounded the alarms at the Riverview Cemetery by alerting the superintendent and secretary that black bodies had been laid to rest in an ostensibly all-white burial ground. "We are under the impression that the Riverview Cemetery is reserved for white interments," Plecker wrote, but William H. Moon, who was from a mulatto family that was striving in every way possible to gain white recognition, had been buried in Riverview on March 17, 1940. Plecker did not insist that the superintendent disinter Mr. Moon, but he certainly suggested it. "We are giving you this information to take such steps as you deem necessary. You probably know whether the state law permits use of a white cemetery by colored people." When the secretary asked what could be done to rectify this situation, Plecker let him draw his own conclusions. "This issue would not be so urgent in the pauper section," Plecker wrote, "but to a grieving white family, it might prove embarrassing to meet with Negroes visiting with one of their graves on an adjoining lot." Doctors and midwives received missives cautioning them that it was illegal to classify any child as white without clear evidence that neither parent had a drop of black blood. Plecker badgered midwife Mary Gilden, "This is to notify you that it is a penitentiary offense to willfully state that a child is white when it is colored. You have made yourself liable to very serious trouble. What have you got to say about it?" Another midwife, Mrs. Robert Cheatham, was browbeaten by Plecker after she assisted in the delivery and racial classification of a baby in 1924. "This is to give you a warning that this is a mulatto child and you cannot pass it off as white. See that this child is not allowed to mix with white children. It cannot go to white schools and can never marry a white person in Virginia. It is an awful thing." It was all an awful thing to Plecker. Midwives misclassifying black babies as white, the specter of integrated public schools and cemeteries, and the possibility of interracial sex and marriage were all appalling, dreadful, and unspeakable. Perhaps Plecker's efforts were so determined and so dogged because he knew that he was fighting a losing battle. No matter how many letters he wrote, he could not control the actions of all Virginians. To make matters worse, he was surrounded by states with more lenient racial laws. On occasion, Plecker sent letters outside of Virginia to sway public opinion against intermarriage. Plecker chastised the editor of the popular New York publication Survey Graphic for deliberately and apparently approvingly featuring interracial marriages on the pages of the magazine. Plecker was struck by a car and died at the age of 86 in 1947, 1 year after his retirement. By that time, eugenics had been discredited by the horrors of the Holocaust. Hitler had studied American eugenics. The Nuremberg laws were based on the same concepts about racial purity that Plecker had swallowed whole. But the Holocaust seared chilling images into the world's mind of atrocities that could result when racial laws were taken to the extreme. 20 years after Plecker's death, the landmark Supreme Court decision Loving v. Virginia, 1967, repudiated the Racial Integrity Act and declared all race-based restrictions on marriage unconstitutional. Although the era of eugenics reached its low ebb with the Loving decision in 1967, during the 1920s it was at its high watermark. So was the motivation to pass. With the memoirs of Anna Julia Cooper and W.E.B. Du Bois in mind, historian Thomas Holt observed that early in these lives there comes some traumatic confrontation with the other that fixes the meaning of oneself before one even has the opportunity to live and make a self more nearly of one's own choosing. In the Jim Crow era, traumatic confrontations were bound to happen. And, as Holt notes, these confrontations need not be dramatic street encounters. More likely, these were quiet stories of one's parents or silences about a painful past. Passing, sometimes compelled by the kinds of traumatic confrontations that were recounted in African American autobiographies, provided an unusual yet effective means of authoring one's own life. The practice allowed those who could pass a means of clandestinely navigating the Jim Crow order. Passing offered much, but it could not mend splintered relationships with one's family. It could not ease a deep-rooted sense of alienation and longing for one's people. Passing was unfit for the task, borrowing from Du Bois, of merging two selves into a better and truer self. This curious phenomenon granted economic privileges and social courtesies, even transformational opportunities for self-fashioning, but often at a terrible cost. During the Jim Crow era, the personal stakes of passing could not have been higher. Unlike the antebellum period where desperate leaps for freedom offered moral cover for an otherwise questionable act, and unlike the Reconstruction era when many African Americans chose not to pass, passing in Jim Crow America was predicated on the racial separation that defined the times. As racial barriers grew higher, so too did the incentive to pass and the finality of the loss one endured. The lines from a Negro spiritual, Chilly Waters, Crossing Over, frame a 1926 article published in Opportunity and expressed the tragedy and pathos of the yearning for freedom persisting in the soul of the Negro during the period of bondage. The elasticity and the doubled, in fact, tripled, meanings of crossing over allow the article's author to fit three major forms of movement, emancipation, migration, and passing, beneath one rubric. The sweeping demographic changes of migration produced new opportunities for crossing over, as demonstrated by Alexander Manly's flight from Wilmington to Philadelphia during the race riot of 1898 and his subsequent decision to pass as white to work as a painter and join a union. He struggled to find work at first. When employers found out that he was black, they insisted that they could not hire him because of union restrictions. "So I tried being white," Manly explained, "that is, I did not reveal the fact that I had colored blood, and I immediately got work in some of the best shops in Philadelphia. I joined the union and had no trouble at all." Manly soon tired of living the life of a sneak, and he took a job as a janitor so he could live openly with his recognizably black wife and children. The social and physical mobility of the Jim Crow era began with what Carter G. Woodson called the early migrations of the talented 10th in the 1870s and 1890s and culminated in the first waves of the Great Migration that saw the exodus of hundreds of thousands of blacks from the South between 1890 and 1930. According to the census of 1900, 83% of African Americans lived on farms or in rural areas and 90% of African Americans lived in the South. Over the course of the 20th century, these Southern peasants would become members of the first African American working class and the backbone of the Northern proletariat. By 1970, the unofficial end of the Great Migration, only 40% of blacks lived in the South. More blacks lived in the city of Chicago than in the state of Mississippi. Migration allowed racially ambiguous people to travel and try on different identities once they were no longer associated with or known in a particular place. The transformative processes of urbanization and migration and the anonymity offered in cities made these worlds of strangers particularly safe spaces to recreate one's racial identity. The term passing itself suggests a type of instability, a moving through, or the lack of a stable home or place. Capturing the possibilities that migration and the cityscape presented in recreating one's identity, one family member wrote of another, "He realized he looked like any white boy, so he started his journey north." Legal scholar Cheryl Harris described her grandmother's journey from Mississippi to Chicago in the 1930s that preceded her decision to pass. Once in Chicago and no longer instantly recognizable as Lula's daughter, Harris's grandmother could easily enter the white world. When she looked for work in Chicago's all-white retail district, no one ever asked if she was black. The question was unthinkable. Unwritten codes of racial decorum at the high-class establishment where she worked prevented such inquiries. For some, leaving home for college created new possibilities for one's racial identity to be either mistaken or altogether reconstituted. In the late 1890s, Anita Hemmings, a beautiful dark young woman, eagerly sought by the men from Yale, Harvard and other universities, arrived at Vassar College. Her boastful and insistent claims about the purity of her patrician background, about her relatives, their style of living, the splendor of her home, and rang false to a blue-blooded roommate, who instructed her father to investigate the matter. Suspicions that her ancestors might have had colored blood mixed with the New England blue blood of which she was fond of talking were soon revealed to be true. The Hemmingses were a respectable black family of moderate means, but they were certainly not to the manor born, as Anita had insinuated. Hemmings's racial identity was revealed a few days before commencement. In a secret session, the faculty decided to allow her to receive a diploma with her class. Perhaps Vassar did not want to betray its reputation as a liberal institution. Anita Hemmings would become the first black woman, at least as far as the university knew, to graduate from Vassar. For others, graduating from college or graduate school created opportunities to refashion one's life. Theophilus John Minton Sifax, the son of an elite black family in Philadelphia, legally changed his name and decided to pass after graduating from Columbia Law School in 1902. As his friends explained, he went away and never, so far as anyone could recall, came back. Sifax found himself in an awkward, impossible position when his parents offered their Washington, D.C., home for the wedding reception of longtime family friends Roscoe Conkling Bruce Sr. and Clara Burrell. As a courtesy, the African-American couple removed Syphax from the guest list. Bruce wrote to Burrell on March 10, 1903, "Yes, let's omit Z from the list of ushers, he would be embarrassed." But, after marrying a white woman and spending almost 45 years as a prominent Wall Street lawyer, Syphax, now known as McKee, traversed the color line once again in 1948 when he realized that he stood to inherit an $800,000 fortune left by his black grandfather. Some reports note that McKee maintained that neither he nor his grandfather was black. He stated that he would not deny nor affirm whether he was a Negro when he was asked directly. He held his ground by stating that he belonged to the best clubs and had influential people, lawyers, judges as his closest friends. Even his wife did not know of McKee's background until he decided to claim his grandfather's fortune. McKee would not live to inherit the trust fund. He died from complications following a serious kidney operation shortly after he made the claim to his inheritance. The choices made by Syphax/McKee offer a striking example of the contingencies and vagaries of racial identity and the opportunism it sometimes produced. Heading off to college provided a break from one's past and a chance to reimagine one's future. A sudden financial windfall could be a powerful incentive to return to the race. Like Theophilus McKee, Elsie Roxborough was born to a storied African-American family. She also chose to pass as white after her college graduation in 1937. Her story also ends in death, but unlike McKee, she took her own life. During the Depression, the Roxborough family lived a life that few Americans could imagine. The family had maids and chauffeurs. Elsie rode horses and drove her father's cars, a Pierce Arrow, a Packard, and a Cadillac. The family vacationed with other black elites at Idlewild, a lakefront resort in western Michigan nicknamed the Black Eden. As one family friend explained, "We knew things were bad, but not for our crowd. We knew people sold apples on street corners but we wore white Lapin jackets in Sunday school." When Elsie Roxborough arrived in Ann Arbor and moved into Mosher Jordan Hall in September 1933, she became the first black woman to live in a dormitory at the University of Michigan. Her father, Charles Roxborough, a renowned Detroit lawyer and the first black state senator elected in Michigan, had passed the Roxborough Bill in 1931 that prevented discrimination in university housing. At Michigan, Elsie wrote for the student newspaper, the Michigan Daily, majored in journalism, and became active in theater. Elsie was at best a mediocre student, and the plays that she directed were panned by critics and audiences alike, but as her friends and family explained, a dogged determination and raw ambition made Elsie both restless and relentless. Elsie was tall and slender, glamorous and vivacious, with beauty and charm that few men, black or white, could resist. She dated the heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, who was managed by her uncle, John Roxborough. Their relationship would not last. Family members speculated that John ended the affair. Louis, nicknamed the Brown Bomber, was beloved by the black community, and he was one of the first African Americans to become a national hero. But he was born to sharecroppers in rural Alabama, and he lacked the culture and sophistication of a high society woman like Elsie Roxborough. Louis may not have been worldly, but Elsie was certainly not a conventional woman of her time. Known as a hellraiser, Elsie once smashed Louis's car when she felt that he was not paying enough attention to her. Langston Hughes was undeniably a better match, but their relationship also failed. Hughes described Elsie as a lovely-looking girl, ivory white of skin with dark eyes and raven hair like a Levantine, but he was rumored to be gay, and Elsie was, as her friends explained, too in love with her work to be serious about any man. Ernest Lehman, the future screenwriter, admired her. Her classmate, the future playwright Arthur Miller, called her a beauty. The classiest girl in Ann Arbor. Langston Hughes wrote that Elsie would tell him her dreams, and wonder whether or not it would be better for her to pass as white to achieve them. After graduating from college in 1937, Elsie moved to California and passed as white to work as a model and a screenwriter. When her fortunes ran dry out west, Elsie moved east. In New York City, she dyed her brown hair a Titian red and dropped the famous Roxborough name to become the unattached Mona Manet. As her brother-in-law explained, Elsie had the most exciting life of any black girl of her time. She was at the top of the Motor City's vibrant social world, but still, she chose to move to New York and go on the other side. Elsie's departure from Detroit's black community did not go unnoticed by the black press. The Michigan Chronicle echoed Elsie's brother-in-law and reported, "Detroit did not supply the exuberant Elsie with the creative outlet that she needed." The Baltimore Afro-American published the article. Elsie Roxborough reported living incognito in Gotham, and noted that much to her family's undisguised disgust, Elsie was trying out a life in New York as a Nordic. Elsie would come back to Detroit for visits to see the folks. Her sister Virgie, who could also pass, was the only family member to visit her in New York. Langston Hughes was in Spain when Elsie wrote him to tell him that she intended to cease being colored. For several years, Elsie wrote letters to Hughes and sent him gifts at Christmas, without a return address on the package. In time, Elsie's letters and gifts stopped altogether, and Hughes never heard from her again. When Elsie's white roommate returned from a weekend trip, she found Elsie in her bed. It appeared that Elsie had committed suicide. As her brother explained years later, maybe Elsie swallowed life whole and had trouble digesting it. Her sister, Virgie, and her aunt, Cutie, could both pass as white, so they traveled to New York with the wrenching assignment of claiming the body. The arrival of these two ostensibly white women allowed Elsie to remain white, even in death. In Elsie's apartment, Virgie and Cutie found a pair of stockings waiting to be washed in the bathroom sink. Elsie must have wanted to live, they reasoned, but perhaps she had too much to drink and had accidentally overdosed on sleeping pills. Elsie had written to her uncle and her father for financial help. They refused her, and 3 days later, she was dead. Virgie would never speak to her father again. After Elsie's death, Virgie received numerous letters of condolence from Elsie's bereaved white friends in New York. One friend expressed the anguish she felt because she could not pay her last respects or contribute flowers to the funeral. A grief-stricken Ernest Lehman wrote, "Mona Manet had many friends in NYC. Apparently we have failed her, the whole world has failed her, all of us, her friends, her family, the world are to blame. We allowed sweet Mona to be lost. Why did this terrible thing have to be? Why?" Years later, Elsie's cousin explained that Elsie was just one of the Roxborough's tragedies. Elsie's mother died when Elsie was 5 years old. Known as the divorcing Roxboroughs, Elsie's father and stepmother's marriage unraveled at a time when divorce was uncommon. Family members and friends described the Roxboroughs as aloof, private, and withdrawn. They were not affectionate or demonstrative and they rarely kissed or hugged. Some family members turned to alcohol as they struggled to negotiate the pressures of sitting at the very top of Detroit's black social and professional worlds. Virgie's husband had an uncle who was a lawyer but whom he never met because he was on the other side. His uncle would see Virgie's father, who also was a lawyer, at court hearings and he would ask about him, even though he could never see him. He invited Virgie to lunch, but Virgie never went. This was as close as he could get to his nephew. After Virgie's death, a relative sent her condolences to Virgie's husband. "I don't think her life was an easy one," she wrote. "So many secrets to keep to herself as well as hurts and disappointments, the lack of closeness in her own family, meaning the Roxboroughs, has poisoned many possible relationships. I never felt there was enough interest to get close to many of my relatives." As she read the letters that Virgie received after Elsie's death, she said solemnly, "I truly wish I had known her, so much creativity and spirit in that woman." Reflecting on the loss of family members who had passed as white and the absence of family feeling among the Roxboroughs, she lamented, "So one does the best they can do. You are aware that you have missed something of what life has to give. It's a sadness that never lets go." Crossing over was a proven strategy for navigating chilly water. At the same time, it raised concerns about how black families would remain whole when nearly white relatives moved away, formed new families, and started new lives. The 1926 article in Opportunity hinted at this dilemma, framing this subtle migration as the most ambitious offensive ever launched by the Sons of Ham, but worrying about the deliberate annihilation of ethnic affiliation when physical appearance does not proclaim it. Family members who brushed against or fully participated in the world of passing undermined black familial stability, leaving the very survival of some families hanging in the balance. Caroline Bonday used the language of social science to challenge the beliefs in racial inferiority held by eugenicists like Walter Plecker with the publication of her master's thesis, A Study of Some Negro White Families, in 1932. An anthropology graduate student at Radcliffe working under the supervision of Ernest Houghton, Day began her study as an investigation into the results of racial intermixture. Houghton wanted to undertake the study, but he feared that blacks would be reticent to talk to a white researcher. Day was the ideal investigator. She was a mixed-race graduate of the Tuskegee Institute and an English and classical literature major at Atlanta University, where W.E.B. Du Bois had been her teacher and mentor. She received a scholarship for advanced study at Radcliffe. Day employed an unusual methodology. She collected the family photographs and genealogical information that comprised the lion's share of her evidence from relatives and members of her elite, racially ambiguous social circle. Day played on the desires of middle and upper-class blacks to be acknowledged by whites. She conveyed the merit and larger significance of her field work by explaining that she was compiling statistics about the better class of colored Americans of mixed blood and that she hoped her project would create a better understanding of the lives and activities of our people. To one hesitating friend, Day wrote, "You know, there is a group of white people who absolutely do not believe that we have such a group as live, for instance, at Highland Beach, a resort town where elite black families vacationed on the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland." Day included her own racial composition: 7/16 white blood, 1/16 Indian blood, 8/16 black blood, and her family's genealogical chart in her project. Family members and friends, proud of the academic success of one of their own, honored to be asked to participate in a study bearing the prestigious Harvard imprimatur, but suspicious of the anthropological underpinnings of the project, were reluctant donors at first, but in the end, many allowed Day to examine their bodies and take their measurements using a caliper, a color chart, and a tape measure. Several participants furnished Day with a precious cache of family photographs. In all, Day collected the physical measurements as well as physiological and sociological information on 346 families and 2,537 mixed-race individuals. Writing in the peculiar language of race, genetics, and blood quantification of her time, Day classified her subjects into three groups: a recessive type, leaning toward the Negro ancestral line, an intermediate type, and a dominant type emphasizing the European characters, and she reported that racially mixed people with 3/8 Negro blood or less showed no signs of having any black ancestry. As Houghton explained, swarthy skins, frizzy hair, and heavy features are conspicuously lacking from quadroons, and these racially ambiguous men and women could easily pass as white, even before the experienced eye of the anthropological observer. Day's study implied that it was very possible that many people who believed themselves to be white had black ancestry, and that passing as white was not only possible, but also quite common. But most importantly, Day demonstrated that racially mixed individuals were normal, well-educated, and middle-class, just like many white Americans of similar class backgrounds. Racial intermixture, contrary to the beliefs of eugenicists and white supremacists, did not result in mongrelization, but unremarkable, in fact, unnoticeable, differences between blacks and whites. As Day explained, there is nothing mysterious or unnatural in the mixture of races and nothing extraordinary in the physical results of those mixtures. Day presented a profile of her study's participants as happily married, college-educated homeowners living in nuclear families with just a few children. Many of the women were full-time housewives. These men and women enjoyed leisure activities including needlepoint, literature, and sports. Despite her groundbreaking work and her status as one of the first African Americans, male or female, to receive a doctoral degree in anthropology, Caroline Bond Day never found an institutional home as an academic, and her work was not reviewed by anthropological journals. Day did receive attention from white sociologists, including Louis Wirth at the University of Chicago and Herbert Goldhamer at Stanford University. Wirth and Goldhamer, impressed by the comprehensive genealogies that Day assembled, included Day's work in an essay that they submitted for Gunnar Myrdal's landmark study, An American Dilemma, 1946. But her project was published at a time when scientists were beginning to move away from biological understandings of race and toward theories of cultural relativism expounded by Franz Boas. As an outsider to the world of black male intellectuals, Day found that there were few positions available to her. She taught drama at Atlanta University until poor health forced her into retirement. In 1948, she died at the age of 59 from heart complications. On the other hand, Day's contemporary E. Franklin Frazier found institutional homes at the most prestigious black universities of his day, Fisk and Howard. Frazier was one of the first blacks to receive a Ph.D. in sociology. He too built his scholarly reputation on an investigation of the black family, completing his dissertation, The Negro Family in Chicago, and earning a degree from the University of Chicago in 1932, where he studied under Robert Park, a founding father of the Chicago School of Sociology. In 1939, Frazier published The Negro Family in the United States and won the John Annis Field Prize for the best book on contemporary race relations. With this publication and award in hand, Frazier became the nation's preeminent black sociologist. He began teaching at Howard in 1934, became the chair of its sociology department, and remained there until his retirement in 1959. In 1948, he was elected president of the American Sociological Association, which made him the first black scholar to head a major academic organization. Frazier garnered international acclaim when he was invited to Paris in 1949 to serve as chairman of a committee of scholars asked by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, to formulate a definition of race in the modern world. Even though Day and Fraser were writing at the same time, they had little contact with each other. Curiously, Fraser did not cite Day's work as foundational in his own arguments that attempted to dispel myths about black racial inferiority. Perhaps Fraser disliked Day for being part of the high society that he ferociously critiqued in Black Bourgeoisie, 1957. Fraser's portrait of this community was unsparing and withering, an isolated, acutely status-conscious society that staged a succession of carnivals, cotillions, debutante balls, clubs, fraternities, sororities, that compensated for their rejection by the white community and sought to achieve identification with upper-class whites by imitating as far as possible the behavior of white society. As the managing editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the black newspapers that Fraser criticized for doting on the black upper class, stated, "If you don't mind being cussed out, belittled, ridiculed and lambasted all at the same time, go ahead and read the book." But the editor admitted, "Yet, the more you read what Fraser is saying, the more you realize that his facts are pretty straight." Fraser was born in Baltimore, Maryland, in 1893. His father was a messenger who had never received any education, and his mother was a former slave. Fraser was teaching sociology at Morehouse College in Atlanta when a white mob forced him to leave after his 1927 essay The Pathology of Race Prejudice was published in Forum and drew parallels between Southern racism and insanity. In the late 1920s, Fraser joined a picket line outside of a movie house in Baltimore that featured D.W. Griffith's racist epic, The Birth of a Nation. A few years later, when Fraser was on a fellowship at the University of Copenhagen and a Danish theater showed The Birth of a Nation, Fraser's protests resulted in the removal of the film. During his 1 year at Tuskegee, he declined to pay the city's voting tax because blacks were disenfranchised, and he refused to join his Howard colleagues in Woodrow Wilson's segregated inaugural parade. In Atlanta, he stormed out of a meeting of social workers upon discovering that the seating was segregated, and he insisted that a bank teller call him Mr. Fraser. If the teller would not comply with his wishes, Fraser would call him by his first name too. As he explained, "There was no power in heaven or hell that could make me call a white man Mr. who did not put Mr. to my name." Fraser taught at Fisk University for 5 years, and while there, he locked horns with the power structure of the segregated South. Fraser lent his support to students who were striking against Nashville's segregation practices, and he investigated a local lynching. At Howard University, Fraser's academic work aimed to reinterpret the black family in a way that would shed light on the plight of African Americans. The Negro family in the United States, as the Washington Post explained, has become basic reading for any serious student of the social problems that beset American cities. The book drew on sociological and historical forces to explain racism and the social limits that African Americans faced. The work of Caroline Bond Day and E. Franklin Fraser, while not specifically designed to study passing, opens a window onto this curious practice and offers evidence and insight into the social and psychological tolls of passing for those left behind. Tactical or temporary passing, the practice of passing momentarily, with a particular purpose in mind, was born in the antebellum period as a means of securing one's freedom by passing as white to escape from slavery. It was reformulated primarily as 9-to-5 passing during the Jim Crow years, enabling nearly white men and women to access employment reserved for whites only. On an undated questionnaire for Fraser's A Study of the Negro Family, one respondent wrote passes for white as the occupation for both his brother and his uncle. Caroline Bond Day bemoaned the difficulties of gathering information for her thesis because of the problems posed by one or more family members who were passing either entirely, or only temporarily for purposes of obtaining lucrative employment. Passing worked as an effective strategy to expand one's employment opportunities, especially in white-collar professions. When asked how many people in his community had passed over into the white race, a man living in Ohio replied, "Yes, a lot of families left the community and went away from here and got positions and their children today wouldn't know they got a drop of colored blood in them. They did this because they couldn't get work no other way." Leona Glover wrote that her grandfather moved from Chattanooga to Chicago, passed into the other race and received a job as an engineer running from Chicago to Detroit. Lloyd Harding Baylor's father had to relocate his medical office from downtown to Detroit's colored district after a misunderstanding occurred between the building's elevator operator and a black patient. The woman asked the elevator operator to take her to the doctor's office. When she was released on the wrong floor, she corrected herself and said that she wanted to see the colored doctor. Soon afterward, Dr. Baylor was informed that his lease would not be renewed. A participant in Caroline Bond Day's study who had the straight hair of her mother, and rather small non-Negroid features prospered in a position as an assistant pharmacist in the Collidine manufacturing plant in Philadelphia, where they did not employ Negro workers. Outmaneuvering racially restrictive hiring practices and enjoying otherwise unfathomable professional success and upward mobility made passing an economically rewarding practice. Given the strict segregation of employment opportunities, simply mentioning that a family member held a white-collar job became shorthand for passing for white. A woman wrote of a relative who was working up in New York State passing as head manager of the largest paper factory in the country. Family members signaled that a relative had a high-paying job by stating that he or she works as white, and it could be assumed that a relative was passing if he or she worked in a particular field or in an all-white establishment. Mrs. J. A. Bass described her son's new life as a white man in Chicago by explaining, he worked himself up at one of Walgreens' stores. And worked until he became the manager of the soda fountain. Reverend Bass hinted that he had a stepsister who was passing by, noting that she worked as a head cook at the White Y in Dayton. By making use of his light skin and good hair, the protagonist in Langston Hughes's short story Passing earned $65 a week and was next in line for a promotion to chief office secretary, a sharp contrast to the colored boy porter who sweeps out the office. In an essay, Why, How, When, and Where Black Becomes White, activist Mary Church Terrell described the discouragement that many colored men faced. With few trades open, for a long time he knocks first at one door and then at another, which he finds can be opened only with a white man's hand. Although this man has always put it behind him, however, as a last resort, too contemptible and cowardly to be considered seriously, now he finds himself out of work, facing a chronic inability to secure a good position. Given its temporary nature as well as its material advantages, this type of passing was generally condoned, and sometimes even celebrated. Reformer Fannie Barrier Williams wrote, since passing was the only means of gaining an equal opportunity, those who were willing to take the risk could scarcely be blamed, since they are certainly not responsible for the anomalous position in which they find themselves. Some family members enjoyed the subversive potential of passing as a practical joke and boasted of the achievements of relatives who successfully got over on whites. Henry Park was the only colored fireman in New Haven, one family member bragged, adding, he neglected to tell them he was Negro. Similarly, Barrington Guy, the son of a wealthy black family in Washington, D.C., and husband of Clara Bruce, Mississippi Senator Blanche Bruce's granddaughter, conceded in 1939, I never tried to pass. Folks thought I was white and I didn't enlighten them. One mother described a letter she received from her daughter who had changed the spelling of her last name from Bass to Boffs as she created her new identity as a white woman. She wrote me that she was going out to get her a job the next day and I took it that she was going to pass for white, because she ended up the writing with a ha, ha. Some blacks agreed with Langston Hughes's assertion that as long as white folks remain foolish, prejudiced and racially selfish, they deserve to be fooled. No better for them. Racially ambiguous men and women engaged in tactical passing to improve their economic lot, but they also used this form of passing to save themselves from the myriad humiliations of Jim Crow life. Yet another folly of American race relations was that by passing as anything other than African American, those who were racially indeterminate or even recognizably black could enjoy better treatment. After a tour of the Gettysburg battlefield during the summer of 1917, the nearly white African American novelist Charles Chestnut and his family stopped for a meal. After a sharp exchange with the hostess, the restaurant's manager briskly approached the Chestnuts' table. Observing the altercation, Chestnut's son instructed the family, Il faut que nous parlons français tout de suite. By speaking French and appearing as foreigners rather than as African Americans, the Chestnuts avoided the indignity of being ejected from the dining room. Similarly, James Weldon Johnson delicately maneuvered through awkward circumstances in a cramped smoking car of a train traveling from Jacksonville to New York. A fortuitous turn of events, beginning with a comment about Johnson's Panama hat, led the passengers to misread Johnson's national identity and to assume that he was from Cuba. Once Cuban, still black, but no longer black American, Johnson relaxed, laughed, and shared a flask of whiskey with the white passengers. But the fun of passing was usually short-lived. Even 9 to 5 and other forms of temporary passing required sacrifices and created anxiety that few could tolerate. In Nella Larson's novel Passing, Claire Kendry marveled at why this practice was not more commonplace. I've often wondered why more colored girls never passed over. It's such a frightfully easy thing to do. If one's the type, all that's needed is a little nerve. But passing required far more than a little nerve, and after a few years of living on the other side, even Claire Kendry would no longer believe her own words. Who are your people? In a memoir of her mother's life, Rona Hartfield reflected on the expansive sense of black family feeling and captured an enduring theme. It is said that colored people all over the world will ask each other upon first meeting, "Who are your people?" Hartfield's question signaled the importance of locating black individuals within larger familial networks and sets of kinfolk. Day Shepard, Hartfield's mother, lived in New Orleans in the 1920s and was encouraged but decided not to join a group of octoroon girls who were seeking white husbands. Shepard was quite familiar with the practice of passing. Her aunt passed to sell perfume as a counter girl in New Orleans, one of her brothers passed and married a white woman, and another brother passed to work as a foreman at the Link Belt factory in Chicago. Shepard, too, lived on both sides of the color line. At a bus station in Grenada, Mississippi, Shepard was faced with an impossible situation when the operators at neither the colored nor the white booth would sell tickets to her. The man working at the colored booth believed that she was white, and the operator at the white booth took note of her brown-skinned children and assumed that she was black. In Chicago, Shepard held a well-paying job working on the conveyor belts at the Automatic Electric Company. She did not volunteer any information about her racial background, and none of her coworkers, recent immigrants from Italy, Lithuania, and Poland, asked questions. As Hartfield explains, this was the kind of tacit passing that allowed my mother to gain a foothold in Chicago in 1918 and 1919. Despite Shepard's intimate exposure to passing, she could not make sense of the familial dislocations that passing permanently necessitated. In slavery days, people got cut off from their families and everything they knew like that, and that was sad, but then there was nothing they could do about it. But these passing people who choose to do that? I can't make any sense out of that at all. All they get in return for giving up everything is people can think they're white. People think I'm white anyway and I don't feel any different. I have my family and my true history. That means something. Shepard's family relationships and her true history were more meaningful than the privileges of looking white. Passing meant letting go of one's people, or as Shepard lamented, of giving up any thoughts of ever seeing one's colored family again, something that she could never conceive of in her mind. How would anybody know who they were without their people? She asked. Shepard found comfort in her close-knit family. We were lucky that all of our people lived right together on the place, and you knew just how everybody was related to everybody else. To Shepard's mind, letting go of one's people was nothing less than letting go of oneself. Shepard's questions lay bare fundamental issues of identity. She locates the essence of one's personhood in one's familial relations and underscores the profound loss of self and the erasure of true history that permanent passing entailed. But the reality of modern American life made the kind of intimacy and closeness that Shepard cherished increasingly difficult to sustain. Fewer family members lived right together in any one place, and it was increasingly uncommon that anyone just knew how everybody was related to everybody else. Rather, passing and the disruption that it caused to many black families occurred in the midst of the unprecedented demographic transformations of a world in flux. Much of the black population was on the move and in the process of dislodging from the very communities that Shepard eulogized. For Caroline Bond Day, at every turn, the problem of passing surfaced and stymied her work of assembling coherent family trees. The handwritten note "Who is passing," the blank spaces, and the question marks left in the columns of questionnaires emblematized the difficulties that Day encountered as she sifted through the evidence for her study. Tangled family histories, fuzzy lineages, and forgotten bloodlines made many of Day's questions difficult, if not impossible, for her subjects to answer. I am sorry that I cannot answer all of the questions. As to the percent of blood, Annie Sims Lewis wrote to Day in 1927, but to be perfectly frank, my father's mother had such a little I hardly know how to estimate it. Another respondent, Alice McNeil, sent a similar message. I've answered the questionnaire as well as I could. I do not know how to figure the proportion of Negro blood. No 5, both of my father's grandfathers were white, the grandmothers being Negro, but what proportion I do not know. They never told their children much, mainly because they were ashamed of their illegitimacy. There is lots of information that we have lost due to that mid- and pre-Victorian reticence. Day's study trod on delicate family matters and few family members felt comfortable unearthing secrets that had been kept for generations. Others appreciated the importance of Day's work but retracted their family photographs when the study went to press. Emma Milliston concluded an otherwise friendly letter with a curt declaration, "I wish to make it quite clear to you that under no circumstances would I like you to use any of my photos or my children singly or in group." Many of Day's participants shared Milliston's reticence and discomfort about revealing their family histories. Describing her mother as a closed book, Mama Penny explained, "Now Carrie dear, about my ancestry, that's one of the hidden mysteries my mother kept to herself. My father I never knew, but my grandmother gave me his name, Crosby. My mother's father was white." Penny offered no explanation about the nature of the relationship between her grandfather and her other family members, but the fact that it was a hidden mystery that her mother did not wish to share with others speaks to the sensitive nature of some interracial family ties. For Penny and many others, the effort required to rake out those horrible ancestral skeletons was simply too much to ask, especially for those who had done their utmost to bury them long ago. Ever persistent in calling in favors from friends and family and eager to obtain the information necessary to complete her study, Day seemed, for the most part, untroubled by the demands that she placed on her respondents. Suspecting that the Percival family might be passing as white in Castile, New York, Day was no less determined to include them in her project. She wrote to assure them that their secret would be safe with her. "Now, I know that you have a very interesting family history, and so I am anxious for you to fill out as much of this blank for me as you will. At the same time, I am cognizant of your situation there in Castile. I presume that it is not generally known there that your family has colored blood, is it? And probably you may not wish any publicity concerning the information that you give me, therefore, if you prefer, I will not make any public use of the information which you give me, but will keep it for my private files." Day was mistaken. The Percival family elected not to complete Day's questionnaire, but not for the reasons that Day imagined. We read and discuss the matter thoroughly. Mrs. Percival wrote to Day in 1928, explaining that her husband decided he did not care to put himself or his family on record much as he appreciated your work. The family could not pass for white, Mrs. Percival reminded Day, but they chose not to draw unnecessary attention to their racial identity. "No, your idea of us was incorrect. We are known as colored, and I would say, or can't exactly, we go for that, only we happen to be the only ones here. If you recall, my husband, he could not pass, and would not, but does prefer to live apart and be just regarded as a man among men, rather than a race man. As for myself, I made it known, when we first come to Castile, that I was of his race and settled the question once for all. Many of Day's subjects opted out. Those who were passing could not risk having family photographs published in a book on mixed-race families, whereas others claimed the right to define themselves as they wished, often relying on more subtle understandings of racial identity and rejecting categorization based on dubious anthropological methods. Passing offered countless freedoms, from the pleasures of sitting in other sections of movie theaters besides the buzzard roost, to the simple dignities of trying on a hat in a store without being compelled to buy it, to the elusive opportunities to feel more like a man or to be treated like a lady. But passing, the anxious decision to break with a sense of communion, upset the collective, congregative character of African American life. It undermined the ability for traditions, stories, jokes, and songs to be shared across generations. Even the task of completing a family history became prickly, if not impossible. To be sure, not all family relationships were congenial, but once a relative decided to pass, meaningful touchstones and common experiences were lost. The fragmentation of one's identity and ancestral memory and the scattering of family relationships represent only a handful of passing's most troubling dilemmas. The levity of fooling our white folks contrasted sharply with the high emotional stakes of passing as white. Passers could not be seen boarding buses headed to or from black neighborhoods, and they had to ignore black family members and friends in public. Passing may have begun as a joke to a woman who worked as white, but she later found that she could keep her job only until she got so nervous that she had to stop. Another woman described her experiences with the darker side of passing. She listened to white coworkers speak about blacks with bitter contempt, and she found herself teetering on a state of nervous collapse, constantly fearing that her secret would be discovered. With the ever-present fear of being exposed, the workplace became an anxiety-ridden site where those who were passing could never rest. Family members were well aware of the significance of guarding the image of whiteness in the white workplace. Some family members used the tense racial dynamics of the workplace to their advantage. Confronted by his ex-wife and his recognizably black children at his job, a man who worked as white had no choice but to meet his ex-wife's demands for money. If he did not, she threatened to go to his white wife and expose his past. The black ex-wife must have believed that her ex-husband was most vulnerable at his place of business, perhaps even more vulnerable than at his home, and that she had the upper hand and had the best chance of getting what she wanted from him there. A woman who participated in Day's study feared that her black ancestry would be revealed when Day's work was published. In a humble and earnest letter, the woman implored Day not to include her family's information. Losing her job was just the start of her worries. "Dear Carrie, I'm very sorry to have to ask you not to use any of that record concerning me. But I made a sworn statement of my status as W and it was contested and I swore that there was no such record of me. Now if at any time it is found out I will be made to leave my job as well as some other things which will cause me serious embarrassments. Please carry on, no condition use it for it will ruin my whole life. I can't write you all the details but will explain when I see you. Although some buckled under the fear of being discovered, others experienced a strange longing for black people and black culture, which is captured best in some of the fictional treatments of the phenomenon. Bored by her pale life, Claire Kendry Larson's novel Passing is attracted to Harlem as if by a magnet, as Nathan Huggins explained, because there is something essential to Negro life, the gaiety, the warmth that she misses in her white world. Claire finds the appeal of Harlem irresistible, and it is this terrible, this wild desire that prompts her reckless actions. She attends Negro balls, introduces black, yet passable, women to her unsuspecting white husband, and repeatedly jeopardizes her identity as a white woman. Huggins's statement risks reifying black life by suggesting that there is something essential to it. He romanticizes its warmth and gaiety. Huggins is not alone. The historical record reflects equally broad overstatements about life within African American communities. In Following the Color Line, 1908, journalist Ray Stannard Baker asked why more light-skinned blacks do not pass. He was given a variety of reasons, all of which reference the jollity of black life. Why, white people don't begin to have the good times that Negroes do, one man explained, adding, they're stiff and cold. They aren't sociable. They don't laugh. These comments are not universal truisms that can be taken at face value. At the same time, the sentiments behind these responses should not be dismissed entirely. These expressions emphasize a belief in the effusiveness, effervescence, and conviviality of black life that sharply contrasts with white life as bereft of levity and laughter. The dimensions of racial identity, although sometimes imagined, amplified, and emotionally constructed, can be powerfully felt, nonetheless. These responses reveal the profound attachments that some blacks had to African American communities, notwithstanding the tendency to sometimes mischaracterize those attachments as inherent racial traits. Many blacks envisioned separating from their communities as psychologically and personally devastating. In some cases, feelings of loss were intolerable, leading some passers to eventually jettison their white identities and to return home to the black community. En route to Cincinnati in a luxurious, first-class cabin, one man's initial enthusiasm about passing waned when he began to ache for black fellowship. The man dined, smoked, and occupied a stateroom with white men. At first, he reveled in his secret, but soon, he was consumed by an unbearable loneliness. In the evening he sat on the upper deck and as he looked over the railing he could see, down below, the Negro passengers and deckhands talking and laughing. After a time, when it grew darker, they began to sing, the inimitable Negro songs. That finished me, he said. I got up and went downstairs and took my place among them. I've been a Negro ever since. A handful of options existed for passers who longed for black family and friends. Returning home was one possibility, convincing light-skinned relatives to pass was another. One woman explained an unexpected and emotional reunion between her father, who was of German and African American descent, and her aunt, who went as white, dated white men, and became an actress. While her father was working as a bellhop, his sister came to the hotel as a guest. The two had not seen each other since childhood but immediately recognized one another. They wanted to embrace each other, but they had to restrain themselves. The sister arranged a secret meeting in her hotel room where she proposed that her brother go as white and travel with her. But the brother could not go along with his sister's plan. He did not want to lose his black friends or give up his status in high black society. Other inconvenient, and emotionally taxing, arrangements were possible. Recognizably black relatives could choose to work as maids in the homes of family members who were passing. Those who were passing could leave white family members behind and visit black relatives clandestinely, and passable blacks could visit with family members who lived on the other side. While versed in the demands and social limitations imposed by the Jim Crow regime, some family members accepted these terms to maintain relationships with relatives who no longer identified as black. Others may have been disappointed or ashamed of their family members' decisions and felt a sense of relief that they could save face when passers ended relationships with black relatives. Jean Thompson explained, "My mother's brother who lives in Philadelphia is a caterer who passes for white there and is married to a white woman. Very few people know this outside of the family, however, his actions do not present a very devastating problem to us for he has first severed all relations with the family and as a result we never hear from him or even know where he lives in Philadelphia." Although Thompson's mother's family did not condone the practice of passing and were very touchy about the matter and freeze up if the matter is brought up even in front of the children, the uncle's decision not to acknowledge either his race or his own family shielded his relatives from the embarrassment had his story become public. As Thompson remarked, "I cannot think of any other outstanding things which we keep locked up as best as we can from the curious tongues and ears of gossips. For some families, it was best to keep the secret not only from whites but also from anyone inclined to spread scandalous information." Family members and friends were likely to keep these matters in confidence, but on rare occasions, blacks betrayed those who were passing. Perhaps it was a larger sense of racial solidarity that compelled blacks to protect the identities of those who lived on the other side. In a 1946 essay, The World and the Jug, Ralph Ellison elaborated on the commonly held belief that blacks had a special eye to detect those who were passing, although the sociologists tell us that thousands of light-skinned Negroes become white each year undetected. Most Negroes can spot a paper-thin white Negro every time. Instances of exposure were unusual. As historian Willard Gatewood explained, once individuals made the decision to pass permanently, most observers agreed that it took more than ordinary provocation for colored people to betray them, because Negroes, of all colors, understood both why they did it and the bitter thraldom and humiliations that came with exposure. A woman who clerked at department stores in Chicago's Loop, however, described being betrayed more than once. First, she worked as a clerk at Mandel Brothers until she lost her job when a black man betrayed her. Undeterred, she worked as white again in a mail-order house. A black postman knew that she was black and visited her desk each morning but never let anyone know her secret. But a black porter disclosed her racial identity when she would not speak to him after she accepted a higher position at Sears Roebuck. These betrayals suggest that though most blacks honored an informal code to protect the identities of those who passed, passers were also bound by particular protocols. And, given their precarious positions, passers could not afford to violate these conventions. When the woman's employers asked for her resignation, they informed her that they did not employ black people and they had mistaken her for a dark-skinned white person. A dark-skinned white person? Perhaps the employers at Sears Roebuck knew that this woman was black, or at least that she was not white, but decided not to say anything about it. Perhaps this woman was a competent worker who arrived on time, conducted herself properly, met her employer's expectations as to how a white woman should act in the workplace, and therefore, never aroused suspicions. If she was friendly with her coworkers, dressed and spoke appropriately, what difference did her racial background really make? But, once someone called it to her employer's attention, as was the case with the physician who lost the lease to his office, once it became a public issue, her employers may have felt that they had no choice but to redraw the boundary that had been crossed. This story suggests that at times, passing may have functioned as an open secret. Employers, neighbors, and friends may have suspected or even known that someone was not white, but as long as the passer behaved appropriately, the secret was kept. Or perhaps as long as other markers of identity, particularly those of class and gender, remained stable, there was less urgency to expose racial transgressions. For some who decided to cross over, the secret could not remain open. The decision to pass required a brutal and absolute severing of familial relations. Ernest Oregano was born into a large black family in New Orleans in 1882. Sometime between 1902 and 1903, Oregano married Violet Parrott, and the couple lived in Oregano's mother's house in New Orleans. In 1904, the couple's daughter, Gladys, was born in her grandmother's house. When Gladys was less than 1 year old, her father took a job as a railroad porter on a line running between New Orleans and San Francisco. For the next year, Oregano continued this work and stayed with his wife and child when he had a stopover in New Orleans. He soon set up a residence in San Francisco but continued his visits with his family. During these trips, he told friends and family members that he was a warehouse man to prevent them from contacting him in San Francisco. At some point after the 1906 earthquake, Oregano made two decisions: he would study law, and he would pass as white. He sent for his brother, Alfred, who was also able to pass. Oregano became a successful lawyer in San Francisco, and by 1915, he stopped visiting his wife and child in New Orleans, but stayed in touch with some of his black relatives. He maintained two addresses in San Francisco, one for his white legal establishment, and another where he could receive mail from his black family members. In 1915, his mother visited him in San Francisco. During the visit, his mother told him that his wife and daughter were dead. When his mother returned home to New Orleans, she informed his wife and daughter that he was dead. There was no further correspondence between Ernest and his wife and daughter, but Ernest did stay in touch with at least one of his sisters. On March 15, 1917, Ernest married a white woman named Pearl Bryant. Their marriage certificate indicated that both of Ernest's parents were white. Violet, believing that her husband was dead, remarried in 1922. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, Ernest Torregano's law practice flourished. He became an expert in bankruptcy law, and he joined the prestigious and politically powerful Lafayette Club. His brother, Alfred, who could also pass, married a white woman and worked as a janitor in a department store. When Ernest Torregano died in 1957, he left an estate valued at $275,000. His wife Pearl died in 1947, leaving his daughter Gladys, unknowingly, as the sole heir. At this time, Torregano's aunt shared critical information with her. Ernest was Gladys's father, and she had a rightful claim to the estate. When Gladys went to court, her uncle, Alfred, vehemently denied that he knew her or that she was related to Ernest. But once Gladys produced a birth certificate and affidavits from those who knew Torregano in New Orleans, the jig was up. Alfred admitted that he and Ernest had been passing as white, but he maintained that he had never heard of Gladys or her mother. Gladys knew that California law stated that a child would inherit an estate unless the child had been specifically disinherited. This led Gladys to believe that her father intended for her to inherit the estate since, as a lawyer, he was quite familiar with the law. Despite the overwhelming evidence in Gladys's favor, the court ruled against her. In accordance with a peculiar clause in Torregano's will, Gladys, Torregano's daughter as recognized by a parade of witnesses, received $1 and the rest of the estate was granted to Alfred. Years later, when asked about her grandfather's decision to pass as white, Gladys's daughter stated, "It's something you learn to live with. We are neither proud nor ashamed. I doubt he would have reached such heights of importance if he had been known as a Negro." Going as white permanently created confusion as some family members disappeared across the color line, creating gaps in family genealogy. One woman explained, "My father's people, half of them pass for white, so naturally I know nothing about hardly any of them." For others, embarrassment and shame prevented an open discussion of family history. Not much has been disclosed about the Patterson family. It is our guess that there were too many blood mixtures of which the immediate family is not any too proud to relate. That this family has many skeletons is without a doubt true. Myrthilda C. Duhay wrote that her father used passing as a strategy to create a new life for himself. She knew little about him or his family because he left New Orleans and deserted the family while they were very young and went over to the white side in Chicago. Others expressed uncertainty about the racial backgrounds of their ancestors. One man questioned his grandfather's race and explained, "Father was always sensitive about that side of his family." When asked whether her relatives in Detroit go for colored or do they go for white, Mrs. Clemens responded, "I don't know, and I don't know what I am. We are 100% American and that is all we can say." Raymond Brownbow did not know much about his maternal grandmother, a mixed-race house servant who was described as being very nearly white. As he explained, "I know very little about her, because it seems that my mother was and is a bit reluctant to discuss her. I remember my mother once telling me that she couldn't stand the remarks that people would make upon learning of her mother's mixed blood, and for that reason she refrained from talking much about her." Others had no choice but to rely on rumors and speculations as to the whereabouts of family members. The only information that Anthony Driver Chase could cobble together about his grandmother, Hester Ann, was that she was light enough to pass for white and had long red hair which reached her waist. Her father was a slaveholder, and she had a brother who went west, married a white woman and passed for white, and it is rumored that he became wealthy. Some family members were able to pass whereas others could not. One relative hinted that other family members passed by explaining, Margot did not know much of her origin. It seems that her brown skin had been responsible for her separation from the rest of the family who were blonde. Other families risked exposing relatives who had crossed the color line by providing too many details about their background. In response to sociologist E. Franklin Frazier's request for his family's history in 1932, T. S. Inborden explained, "I will say that I have not more than 1/16 Negro blood in me, if indeed that much. The rest is Mohawk and Caucasian." To publish this would cause a lot of talk and embarrassment. The first governor of Texas was, perhaps, half-brother to my grandmother. Others lacked critical information to piece together their family histories. Emblematic of the tensions created by passing, such omissions and doubts led to profound feelings of desertion, disconnection, and incompleteness. One man, describing his great-uncle, explained, "I know of one brother, the father of a large family. They passed over into the other race and were finally lost to those who remained in the Negro race." Trying to make sense of an absent father who looked like white, Pearl Foreman wrote, "The strangest thing was, No one ever told me about my father's people or from whence he came. I have not been able to find out any information concerning him, only that I resemble him in every respect. Once family members crossed over, they were usually lost, essentially dead to their families. But the equation of passing to death too quickly dismisses both the ambiguity and the logic of passing, as well as the tolerance and understanding that family members extended to those who passed. Why else would a relative agree to work as a maid in a family member's home in the interest of continuing an untenable relationship in the Jim Crow era? As passing disrupted family life and made certain topics of conversation awkward if not impossible, it also called into question one's own identity and sense of personhood. The question that Day Shepherd posed, how would anybody know who they were without their people, suggests much broader and more intimate meanings of race and racial identity and reveals the interconnectedness of notions of self and family. In every historical period, there are those who decide against passing, even though they are often mistaken as white. Freddie Washington first appeared as a chorus girl in Shuffle Along, 1921, one of the most successful African-American Broadway musicals, but she is best known for her role as Paola, a light-skinned black woman who breaks her mother's heart by choosing to pass as white in the 1934 film Imitation of Life. As Esquire magazine reported in 1935, the scenes between Paola and her mother stole the show. The tragedy of the colored girl trying to pass for white completely overshadows the artificial little troubles concocted for the white folks. The audience leans intently forward whenever Louise Beavers, Aunt Delilah, or Freddie Washington, the daughter, is in the scene and simply relaxes even during the dramatic moments of the story proper. In May 1935, Universal Studios reported that Imitation of Life was the largest grossing film of that year so far, which led many movie houses to return the film to the screen. Washington's appearance, her blue-gray eyes, white complexion, and light brown hair, and her compelling performance in Imitation of Life led some of her fans to presume that Washington had first-hand experience with passing. Washington explained, "If I made Paola seem real enough to merit such statements, I consider such statements compliments and makes me feel I've done my job fairly way," but she was clear that her private life is in no way similar to that of Delilah's daughter. When the German philanthropist Otto Kahn saw Washington dancing at Club Alabama in Manhattan and suggested that she change her name and pass as French, she responded, "I want to be what I am, nothing else." Washington was often asked why she chose not to pass. She would reply, "Because I'm honest, firstly, and secondly, you don't have to be white to be good. I've spent most of my life trying to prove that to those who think otherwise. I am a Negro and I am proud of it." Washington would allow whites to speak disparagingly about African Americans and then shock them with the truth about her racial identity. In the presence of whites who assumed she was white too, Washington remarked, "I give them plenty of rope. I let them talk, hang themselves, and then I quietly say, I'm Negro." Washington did pass as white occasionally. When she was traveling through the South with Duke Ellington and his band, she would go into ice cream parlors and buy ice cream for the band members, who were excluded from restaurants. Whites called her a nigger lover. Described as honest, sincere, and fearless, Washington rarely held her tongue. She was a passionate spokesperson for blacks in theater and film. She founded the Negro Actors Guild in 1937, and she wrote a column called Freddie Says for the People's Voice, the progressive weekly published by Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the pastor and first black politician to represent New York in Congress. She was an outspoken critic of black artists whose calls for equal rights were not loud enough. Washington perceived the struggle for civil rights as a lifelong battle. "I am here as a Negro, then that's the way I'll be and I'll fight until the day I die, or until there isn't anything left to fight against." In stripping away one's ascribed status, passing offers a sharper angle of vision onto the personal meanings of racial identity from the perspective of black individuals and communities. The communal politics of passing demonstrate the insufficiency of explanations of passing as a rebellious, individualistic practice and instead reveal the ways that race operated on the most private levels and in the innermost reaches of black communities. Passing, the vexed decision to break with a sense of communion and walk away from what was most precious about African American life, is a vehicle to recover and to concretize the most elusive and intimate meanings of African American group identities. At the conclusion of a 1952 essay, Langston Hughes described the moment when he arrived at the Haus Vaterland in Berlin and two black waiters greeted him enthusiastically, "Hey now! What gives in Harlem?" This exclamation, uttered several thousand miles away from the race capital, is reminiscent of the question, "Who are your people?" as it suggests an elastic sense of connection and kinship, grounded in the sharing of something much more elusive than skin color or residence in Harlem. A similar experience occurred when Hughes was in Shanghai, riding in a rickshaw. He saw a very colored man in another rickshaw, traveling in the opposite direction. As the two made eye contact, the following exchange occurred: as soon as we spied each other through the traffic in the busy street, he half rose and I half rose, and both of us yelled, "Hey!" The rickshaw went on. I never saw him again the whole time I was in China. I never knew his name. But race had greeted race across space. And I remember his grin much more clearly than I remember the features of any of the other faces. To be sure, in these foreign contexts, it was skin color that allowed Hughes to make these connections and to recognize the waiters in Berlin and the very colored man in the rickshaw in Shanghai. But was it really race that greeted race across space? As the experiences of many of those who passed as white as well as many of those who were left behind reveal, race is so much more than this. Race functions as a proxy for a shared and expansive set of experiences, memories, jokes, stories, and songs. It was only because race was so much more than either biology or shared oppression that Hughes could find the grin on the very colored man's face so memorable.